The Sunday thriller next week is The Savage Bees, at the same time, 20 to 9 on BBC One.
Regeneration. Fourth. Goodness me, so there are 5 of me now.
The resources of all 5 doctors are put to the test in a special 20th anniversary edition of Doctor Who. Old enemies, old friends, and some new situations.
Oh, thank you.
Brigadier.
Yes, well, thank you very much for rescuing me, Doctor. Now perhaps you'll explain why I'm here to need rescuing.
Steady on, Sarah Jane. I'm not exactly here by choice either, you know.
All 5 doctors master the situation in 90 minutes of adventure, coming to BBC One.
Tonight's Omnibus, in 15 minutes, finds out about the new National Theatre musical about Jean Seberg and meets sculptor Harry Jackson. Now, at 11 minutes past 10, the news on BBC One with Jan Leeming.
Lebanon, America ready to retaliate. Syrians and Lebanese cancel a summit meeting. President Reagan looks across the Korean divide. Sinn Féin's new leader says the armed struggle in Ulster will continue. And throughout Britain, the victims of war are remembered. Syria's President Assad has cancelled a summit meeting he'd planned for tomorrow with his Lebanese counterpart, Mr. Gemayel. And that, according to our correspondent just back from Beirut, is a clear sign that both countries are preparing for a limited strike by the Americans in Lebanon. President Reagan has vowed to avenge the murder of his Marines in Beirut. It's now been confirmed that all Western commercial flights to the Lebanese capital have been cancelled for the next few days. And reports from Beirut tonight say American warplanes have been flying over the city. More details from our correspondent Christopher Morris.
Officially, tomorrow's important meeting has had to be cancelled because Syria's President Assad is now in hospital with an undisclosed illness. There had been hopes that the meeting in Damascus with President Jamal would help to defuse the present Middle East tensions. Tonight's announcement, coupled with the decision by Western Airlines to suddenly cancel flights to Beirut, has had the opposite effect. The international airport is guarded by US Marines and was forced to close for several hours last Monday after heavy fighting broke out with leftist Muslim militiamen. Sporadic shooting and shelling has continued almost daily in the area around the Marines' positions, the militiamen apparently trying to provoke an American attack. And after the suicide bomb blast that killed 237 Marines at their Beirut headquarters exactly 3 weeks ago, such an attack has been awaited ever since. There are now all the signs of a retaliatory strike going ahead against the militia forces in Lebanon. Several times in the past week, American F-14 Tomcat planes have been scrambled to fly over Beirut on reconnaissance missions. And now, a huge American task force has arrived off the coast carrying a replacement Marine unit. A total of 32 warships, 300 aircraft and over 3,000 Marines. To back up this formidable naval force is the battleship New Jersey, with its enormous firepower, which has just returned unexpectedly from Egypt. To add to the complexities of the present Middle East crisis, Syria has already placed its army on alert and called up reservists.
President Reagan flies back to Washington tonight at the end of his Far East tour. This morning he visited the American troops who guard South Korea's border with the North, the first time an American president's been up to the frontier. He started by joining his men at their church service.
A provocation, North Korea called the visit, and nobody intended to ignore the implied threat. Watched by a choir of Korean orphans and rather tougher security men, the president was driven almost to the altar and took his place in the front row, shielded by an armoured personnel carrier.
America, America, God shed his grace on thee.
A few minutes later, the president was seeing the frontier for himself from guard post Collier, half a mile from North Korean positions. Taking no chances, the US brought in extra units to protect the president. Ever since the Korean War, this has been one of the world's danger spots. There are now more than 500,000 men under arms in both North and South Korea. And the intelligence experts say the North could mount an invasion into the South with just 12 hours' notice. In a presidential address from a specially prepared bunker, Mr. Reagan told his soldiers that they were in the front line of freedom.
You stand between the free world and the armed forces of a system that is hostile to everything we believe in as Americans. The communist system to the North is based on hatred and oppression. It brutally attacks every form of human liberty and declares those who worship God to be enemies of the people.
The South Korean army put on a different demonstration in the afternoon. They have a reputation for being hard-headed soldiers off as well as on the display ground. Theirs is an approach that Mr. Reagan applauds. Freedom, he says, is purchased with strength. It's been the message of his Far East tour.
As the 2-minute silence ended at the Remembrance Day ceremony around the Cenotaph in London's Whitehall, 100 peace demonstrators threw themselves to the ground in a mock die-in at Parliament Square a few hundred yards away. 22 members of a group calling itself Peace Anonymous were arrested and charged with insulting behaviour. The official service went ahead without interruption, but security was strong.
Police vigilance was even keener than usual on occasions like this, but it was a demonstration-free remembrance service with its traditional ceremony. The start of 2-minute silence was signalled by a cannon fired from Horse Guards Parade. Prince Charles was standing in for the Queen, who's in Kenya on a state visit. The first time for 15 years she's been out of Britain on Remembrance Day. On a bright but chilly morning, thousands of people stood in Whitehall as the Prince laid the first wreath at the Cenotaph. Prince Andrew was to follow him, his wreath bearing an inscription in memory of servicemen killed in the Falklands campaign. Then it was the turn of the politicians. The Prime Minister paid tribute on behalf of the government to the men and women who gave their lives for their country. Wreaths were also laid by the other party leaders in honour of the dead of 2 world wars and of other conflicts. The Queen Mother, Princess Anne and the Princess of Wales were on a balcony overlooking Whitehall to watch the march past by 5,000 ex-service men and women. They're the focus of the nation's respect on Remembrance Day, and they were greeted with warm and admiring applause. The SDP leader, Dr. David Owen, was excluded from the Cenotaph ceremony. He attended a service in his constituency, Devonport, and wouldn't comment on the government's refusal to invite him.
The Archbishop of Canterbury attacked what he called the madness of the nuclear arms race in his Remembrance Day sermon. Dr. Runcie, who's in Dresden, East Germany, said there must be an end to the sterile abuse between East and West. Sinn Féin's new president, Gerry Adams, has paid tribute to those he called the freedom fighters of the IRA. At the party's annual conference in Dublin, he pledged continued support for the campaign of violence, but also indicated that Sinn Féin will increase political pressure and try to build on recent electoral successes.
There is change within the provisional movement. One part of it is extending a hand towards legitimate politics. The old guard of the movement, the men who created the provisionals, today gave way. This is the new message: to vote for what they call Republican socialism. These are the new activists, young people from Republican areas in Ulster where unemployment is high and moderate voices count for less and less. And this is the new leader of the provisional movement, Gerry Adams, the MP for West Belfast. His purpose, what he called a planned offensive at the ballot box. And yet this new emphasis won't mean any lessening of IRA terror. This morning, in a debate closed to the media and under the noses of Irish Special Branch men waiting in cars outside, an IRA man in combat uniform told delegates the IRA supported the new political campaign. But, he said, the violence would continue alongside it. The IRA man got a standing ovation. So too did Gerry Adams. And delegates clapped him loudest when he defended what he called the right of Irish people to continue the armed struggle.
Paul Clark, the RUC constable killed by the IRA last night. He died when at least 6 homemade mortars were fired from the back of a lorry at a police station at Carrickmore in County Tyrone. The shells cleared a perimeter security wall, hitting a canteen and recreation area where about 40 policemen were relaxing. 7 policemen were injured. A pilot died this afternoon after his light aircraft crashed at Fareham in Hampshire. His plane, a Cessna two-seater, hit a railway viaduct and ended up in a creek. Passing motorists helped free him from the wreckage. He was named later as Mr. Stuart Savage, a gliding instructor who lived in Hampshire. There was no one else on board. John McEnroe has won the Benson & Hedges tennis tournament. In this afternoon's final at Wembley, he beat Jimmy Connors in straight sets 7-5, 6-1, 6-4, winning over £32,000.
The match could have been explosive after some early controversial line calls. A key moment was when McEnroe dropped 3 set points and then had his service broken by a call which both players knew was wrong. His restraint was almost painful to watch. But it was Connors who, amid the enthralling tennis, allowed his mouth a little too much rain.
Code violation. Order of Senator Mr. Connors. Warning.
Connors served to stay in the first set, which had been amusing, thrilling, and lasted 75 minutes. When McEnroe won it 7-5, Connors' resistance crumbled. He lost the next 6-1 in 30 minutes, and McEnroe raced on to his 5th Benson & Hedges title in 6 years. With such a success rate, McEnroe must feel he almost owns the singles trophy. And thanks to a relatively easy final, he was still fresh enough to help Peter Fleming retain their doubles crown too.
The Queen has returned for the first time to the place where 32 years ago she was told that her father had died and she was Queen. She and Prince Philip were continuing their Kenyan tour with a visit to the Treetops Safari Lodge.
The little house in the giant fig tree where a princess became the Queen 31 years ago is long gone, burned in the Mau Mau troubles. On the opposite side of the waterhole is the present much grander treetops, still presiding over a mass of wildlife which comes to slurp and wallow in the warm brown water. Man is an intruder, and bad-tempered buffalo are not respectful of anyone. So the Queen was escorted by an armed hunter as she returned to the game lodge, which made world headlines in 1952. On the night her father died, she'd been watching elephants and rhino. Today, gentler creatures came to stare, and the baboons got on with afternoon drinking and relaxing. There must have been memories, but nothing sentimental was in evidence, just a 30-pound cake which took 2 weeks to create and a certain amount of time to deal with. The press were having a spot of buffalo bother. An obstinate middle-aged specimen was patrolling the press barrier. Led by an intrepid hunter, Fleet Street's wildlife approached with unusual caution and eventually gained ground. With much more aplomb, the Queen approached, walking to the very place where she'd been in the original treetops when she became Queen. It was a day for remembering, and in the end, even the buffalo gave in to the mood.
Finally, on this Remembrance Sunday, Prince Andrew's been talking about his own memories of war when he served as a helicopter pilot in the Falklands. He was speaking on TVAM after the launch of his appeal for the SS Great Britain, itself recovered from the Falklands 13 years ago.
the worst thing was actually the destruction of everything that was. I mean, I saw one ship particularly, Atlantic Conveyor, hit, and seeing it hit, and seeing the bits and pieces that rained around in the water. I mean, there were splashes in the water about sort of a quarter of a mile away. But I mean, that is what I remember. However, if it happened at the time, I don't know. I mean, one sees things at moments like that. It was an experience I shall never forget, and it's still a vivid memory imprinted on my brain, as it were, and I think it will be there for a long time. But horrific.
And that's all from the newsroom for this weekend. Good night.
For anyone hoping to see more of today's tennis highlights on BBC One later tonight, we regret that the programme has now been cancelled owing to an industrial dispute.
Good evening to you. It looks as if you're going to need to get those overcoats out of mothballs tomorrow, especially in the south, where there'll be a really keen wind. And that's going to be caused by a combination of this area of high pressure over Scandinavia and the low down here to the southwest of us. They're both edging our way, and in the process they're tending to squeeze these easterly winds in across the country. So let's look at the satellite picture, and you can see that a short time ago much of the continent under clear skies was already having a fairly sharp frost, and skies have cleared now over England and Wales, and so with temperatures dropping to about -1 or -2 degrees centigrade, we'll be having a fairly sharp frost as well. 1 or 2 showers to run onto some eastern coasts of England, and the north of Scotland escaping any frost, because there'll be some cloud and perhaps just 1 or 2 spots of rain. And then when we move on to tomorrow, the theme is certainly going to be that cold wind, a fairly biting wind in these more southern counties, and a strong wind at that. Most places, though, will have a dry day tomorrow, and a fairly bright one. At least there'll be some sunshine, despite the fact that it will be cold. There is a chance, though, of 1 or 2 lightish showers in that southwestern corner of the country, and the north of Scotland, too, will have a fair bit of cloud, and just here and there 1 or 2 spots of rain, and that northern part of Scotland as well will be rather on the windy side. Well, that's all for now. A very good evening to you.
Now, with news of tomorrow's panorama, here's Mike.